Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Eva Díaz, an art historian whose teaching and research explores the history and contemporary practice of interdisciplinary collaborations between artists and other cultural producers. Eva is a prolific scholar and writer. Her first book, The Experimenters, Chance and Design at Black Mountain College, was published in 2015 by the University of Chicago Press. And her next book, forthcoming in February 2025, is called After Spaceship Earth. It'll be published by Yale University Press, and it looks at the influence of Buckminster Fuller in contemporary art, and in Eva's words, takes up artists' challenges to a privatized and highly surveilled future in outer space, analyzing how the space race, and race is in scare quotes, and colonization can be reformulated as powerful means to redress economic, gender, and racial inequality, as well as ecological injustices. She edited and contributed to the monograph Dorothea Rockburn, published by Dia Art Foundation in Yale in 2024, and is currently at work on A Riot of Perfume, the Biopolitics of the Senses, which will be, her talk today will be related to. This book explores, or will explore, non-visual experiences in art, such as olfaction, the sense of smelling, topological procedures, and haptics, touch and feedback, physical feedback, by examining the overvaluation of certain experiences in culture, such as vision and cognition, distance and analysis, for example, and the devaluation of other kinds of experiences like smell, sensuality, proximity, as opposed to distance, and the body. So we'll hear more about that shortly. Eva has also written numerous scholarly articles, book chapters, and reviews. Her articles and reviews have been published in, to name a few, Aperture, Art Forum, Art Journal, Art in America, Cabinet, e-flux Journal, Freeze, Grey Room, October, New Left Review, Texte zur Kunst, which is one of the leading German language arts publications, quite a serious one, and the Art Bulletin, which is the academic or scholarly journal of the College Art Association, which is the academic organization for art professors and professors of art history and visual studies. Eva's work has been supported by the Warhol Foundation, Creative Capital. They have a joint art writers grant, the Graham Foundation, the Huntington Library, and the Getty Research Initiative. Eva was recently promoted to the rank of full professor in the Department of the History of Art and Design at Pratt, and previously she taught at Parsons, Sarah Lawrence College, and the Whitney Independent Studies curatorial track. She also served as curator at Art in General, which is a long-standing and well-regarded nonprofit space that unfortunately closed its doors during the pandemic in 2020. Eva received an MA and a PhD in art history from Princeton University and a BA in art history from University of California, Berkeley, and she participated in the Whitney ISP. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Eva Díaz.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mark, for that introduction and for having me. Thank you, Isabel, for having me. I'm getting over bronchitis, so actually, I'm going to get my cough drops handy. So excuse if I'm a little raspy. So I just want to give a little forecast about what we'll be doing. There is going to be a scent component about like 15 minutes, 10 minutes before we finish. It's a work by an artist named Maki Ueda called Arrow Sculpture. So if you don't want to participate, there'll be scent strips going around. And so you're welcome to just like step outside for that period. It'll probably be about 5 minutes that the scent would even carry. Just to let you know, it's a scent that it's so hard to tell you what it is, sort of like jumping the gun, but it is around temple incense in Japan. So that's part of what the scent is connotes, I suppose. So yeah, so this is going to be about 45 minutes of a longer essay that I'm working on related to the work of Fujiko Nikaya, but also works that involve fog and breath. So it's a new direction in this book on non-visual senses that Mark had mentioned. So I'm really going to welcome your questions during the Q&A, as it is a work in progress and there's new directions opening up all the time. And this one was unexpected, and it comes out of a section on olfactory art specifically, like artists working on scent coming from a visual arts kind of position. And just to give you a context for what the book is looking like, it includes a chapter on art and excuse me, art and topology. So that's practices that explore like non-Euclidean spaces that are otherwise unrepresentable by visual means. So imagining multidimensional spaces, but also the practices of folding, in which like part of the work would be hidden, which is a sort of a topological practice. The book also contains a chapter on the derangement of visual certainty by op artists. So sort of taking vision, pushing it to its limit, and considering their emphasis on the vulnerable sensate body. Third chapter takes up how artists decolonize landscape by using oral and sonic experiences that contest regimes of surveillance and scopic control, particularly from the history of photography and its way of surveilling landscape. And then this other chapter that this work comes out of is about olfactory works that propose new biopolitical understandings of embodiment. So this kind of extension of the olfactory work investigates respiration, breath, and non-visual experiences. And so it's really focusing on Nikaya's career-long exploration of atmosphere and airborne exchange. So I'll leave aside the bulk of the discussion about the profound legacy of her practice in art and architectural works that use air and molecular dissemination as their primary medium. But I am going to, with the exception of a little bit of analysis of the work of an acolyte of Nikaya's named Maki Ueda, whose work is the one we're going to smell together today. So this long preamble aside, let's begin to think molecularly. So consider the makeup of something extremely intimate, though also very public, the air we are breathing. It's not only always proximate to us, like our clothing, but it physically enters our bodies with our every inhalation. So let's breathe together. So take a deep breath right now and exhale. The yoga moment. Do you know what you just inhaled? So at our elevation, I'll tell you, which is nearly sea level, papers out of order, so-called dry air is a mixture of gases. So it's approximately 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, 1% argon, and 0.04% carbon dioxide, with trace atoms and molecules, including ammonia, carbon monoxide, methane, neon, among others. But the atmosphere is in fact rarely dry and is affected by variable gases, the most common of which is water. So about 1 to 4% of the air we're breathing is water vapor, depending on how humid one's climb. And this vapor sometimes forms small liquid droplets like mist or fog. So every breath that we take also contains millions of aerosols, which are solid particles like dust, pollen, fume, and smoke that are called particulate matter. Almost everything we consume comes to us from human-directed production processes, but not air. The material constitution of air is afforded to us, by the plenitude of nature, originating independently of human invention and control, with the exception of closed systems like space capsules, though they actually synthesize air and water that they bring from Earth. Though these days, even air on Earth is not entirely independent of humanity's transformations of it. About 10% of aerosols are anthropogenic pollutants, like the sulfate aerosols resulting from fossil fuel combustion and car exhaust, the carbon produced by biomass burning, and the chemical fumes downwind of industrial areas. Aerosols are often microscopic, but some heavy particulates become visible, like smog and smoke. For the most part, we are scarcely conscious of this largely invisible, odorless, and tasteless atmosphere of our planet. This is only a fraction of our attention is directed to our intake of it through breath, which for all animals is primarily an involuntary process. So I turn our attention to these issues of the materiality of the atmosphere to consider the cloudworks of Nikaya, born in 1933 in Sapporo, Japan. She initially undertook these as part of a complex multisensory installation developed with the collective Experiments in Art and Technology, EAT, in this Pepsi Pavilion in Osaka, Japan for Expo 70. Nikaya created, in collaboration with physicist Thomas Mee, an apparatus that pressurizes water at 500 psi to force it through small nozzles, creating vapor that then spreads into droplets of approximately 20 micron width. In calm wind, the pavilion was thus fully draped in fog. Nikaya's cloudworks, of which she's designed dozens since the initial Pepsi Pavilion, both indoors and out, make visitors aware of the normally invisible spaces between people and objects, paradoxically by using the obscuring properties of fog to mark how air is a necessary but imperceptible chemical component of a surrounding atmosphere, an overlooked yet constitutive element of any environment. In considering the example of Nikaya, employing the concept of the atmospheric complicates the notion of the environmental that has long served as wallpaper to human existence. Humans often think of ourselves as creators or destroyers of environments, understood as the area encompassing, but nonetheless external to us, something we might be able one day to even author. Such a separation posits not only the detachment of nature from culture, its timelessness as against human histories, but also presupposes the autonomy of humanity, as if people might exist free from the microbes within and on the body, or could regulate the very molecules we inhale. The artificial division of the human and the environment has long been abetted by the visual nature of art, which privileges sight and distance surveil, disconnecting vision from the material entanglements of other senses. In her more than 50-year career, Nikaya has instead explored both visual and non-visual experiences, examining the overvaluation of certain forms of knowledge, particularly but not exclusively in Western culture, vision cognition, distance and analysis, the devaluation of others, breath, sensuality, proximity, and the body. So beginning with the Pepsi Pavilion, and in her work in Canberra, Australia, her recent pieces at Philip Johnson's Glass House, the Tate, Haus der Kunst Munich, and other locations around the globe, she investigates how to counter the denigration of the non-visual, foregrounding instead other kinds of sensation, the evanescent qualities of the gaseous and airborne, the thermodynamics of heat and vapor circulation related to haptic experiences of touch, the encounter with largely invisible gravitational forces, and the empathetic exploration of non-human and essentially imperceptible experiences such as photosynthesis and plant growth. Nikaya is not the first or only artist working with fog and water vapor. Of her peer group, notable works include Hans Hacke's Water and Wind from 68, Robert Morris's Steam, 67 to 74, Anthony McCall's Line Describing a Cone, 73, Bill Viola's The Vapor from 75. Nikaya and Viola subsequently collaborated on an artwork. In recent projects, such as Olafur Eliasson's The Mediated Motion, The Weather Project, and Fog Assembly, those three, And also Teresa Margolis's Vaporización from 2001, which I should mention, employed vapor produced from the sterilized water used to clean corpses. Anthony Gormley's Blind Light from 2007. Peter Pong-Weerasethakul's Vapor, Thomas Saraceno's Particulate Matters. And then Makiueta's Invisible White and Era Sculpture, which is the work that we'll be talking, or that I'll be focusing a little bit on later. These works have all used mist and fog, some oftentimes created with water vapor. Nikaya's work is a direct progenitor of Diller Scafidio's Blur Building from 2002, constructed on Lake Neuchâtel for Swiss Expo, a work of, quote, pure atmosphere, according to Liz Diller, for which Nikaya served as a consultant. Unlike the Haka, McCall, and Morris works, but much as the Blur Pavilion explored, the artificial ecologies of Nikaya's fog sculptures is sustained with immense energy expenditure, though the effects of her work in fact trouble the prospect of the large-scale geoengineering of surrogate environments for human habitation. And distinct from some works by Eliasson, her project is not to manufacture what one could call a technological sublime that spectacularizes nature. Instead, her works use complex technologies to instead sensationalize, to use this word against its common associations with overstatement and embellishment. Sensationalize is a calling attention to the sensate, embodied experiences, for example, proprioception, which is the way we orient our body in space, and respiration through cloud and fog phenomenon. So these phenomena, which were formerly only experienced as ephemeral natural occurrences, not ones produced by artists. Using the most common and abundant substances on Earth, water and air, Nikaya's concern with the ecological codependency of humans and their environments, and their surroundings, is, according to art historian Anne-Marie Duget, a, quote, green media par excellence, unquote. Atmospheric art created in the wake of Nikaya's precedent recognizes how the power of the airborne can create bridges between humans and nature, producing a holistic biopolitical notion of a commons, what the artist Thomas Saraceno has termed an ocean of air. Nikaya labors by necessity in interdisciplinary, sorry, to move on here, and collaborative fashion, as understanding the volatile molecules and compounds that allow air to support terrestrial life, and the human-triggered, quote, chemical colonization of the Earth that has resulted in toxicities of both deodorization and industrial pollution, requires that she work in concert with physicists and other scientists and confer with local communities familiar with the land, its plants, and the animal species inhabiting the terrain. And the connections her atmospheric art makes between scientists and local populations. Such work is concerned with what geographer Mergen Neuenhuis terms the, quote, ecological embeddedness, unquote, of breath. Breathing is not only a largely involuntary process, but it also involves a transcorporeal mixture of matter. As we inhale the various molecules in the air, others also breathe. Fog works foreground this dynamic quality of sensation and aesthetics, bringing greater meaning to the vulnerability of respiration, inspiring, literally and profoundly, taking the outside in. So I'm just going to give a little history of the EAT Pepsi Pavilion. Somewhat of a digression, but there's just some really fabulous things to look at, so I couldn't help it. The origins of the somewhat improbable EAT Pepsi Pavilion relationship can be traced to artist and filmmaker Robert Breer, who designed these mobile sculptures for the pavilion, who befriended his Manhattan neighborhood David Thomas, a Pepsi executive interested in art. Thomas soon asked Breer to design the pavilion Pepsi was planning for Osaka, but Breer demurred a sole authorship role and introduced Thomas to EAT. Eventually, EAT founders Billy Kluver and Robert Whitman and member artist Forrest Myers and pianist composer David Tudor drafted a proposal for Pepsi. The EAT team originally struggled with producing a coherent yet collaborative vision for their involvement with the site. According to a project chronicle written by engineer Nilo Lindgren, quote, Robert Rauschenberg, who was also an EAT founder, suggested that they should shift their approach to include elements that appealed to all the senses rather than just the visual. That is, elements that would create what people would feel as an invisible environment. Eventually, the proposal included a complex sound installation activated by users' footsteps designed by Tudor. This just gives you a map of the interior of one section, a tactile floor using textures such as gravel, carpet, and glass, with a Whitman-designed inflatable mirror dome producing holograms suspended over it, a so-called clam room outfitted with lasers, and an unrealized solar sculpture by Myers, and the series of outdoor kinetic fiberglass float sculptures you saw previously by Breer. Activating all the senses was the goal. According to Lindgren, the engineer, quote, different smells were even considered and abandoned. It was remembered that Mike Todd's son had spent several $1 million for a movie Smelly and hadn't solved the technical problems. This was a kind of like debacle of like trying to make Scentorama, like a smell-based movie experience. And it was Elizabeth Taylor's husband's son got involved in all this, and Elizabeth Taylor, her movie premiered it, and it was for various reasons of a competitive project that was really bad. The whole thing was written down in history as this really, really bad idea, is to make, you don't do smellies, no movie smells. Because people would like, there'd be a breakfast scene and like the smell of bacon would go on like for like 10 minutes, like ruining the love scene later, you know. So, and I just also want to note, I mean, this is a total sidebar, but the acronym EAT is of course the gustatory eat, which I suspect stems from Rauschenberg's love of linguistic play and anagrams, rebuses, puns, etc. So the story of Nikaya's involvement begins with a wonky dome. By the time EAT was attached to the project, the pavilion structure had already been designed by Tadashi Doi of the general contracting firm Takanea Komuten. It was a 120-foot span geodesic dome, 75 feet in height, skinned with PVC, polyvinyl chloride panels. It was located in the Expo Land part of the park near the south gate of the fair site. The precedents of Buckminster Fuller's space frame and geodesic dome architectures are essential to mention, and the strong influence of his US Pavilion Dome at Expo 67, 3 years previously in Montreal, is evident in nearly every Osaka pavilion structure in 1970. Indeed, Fuller-inspired geodesic designs dominated the Uzo Nishiyama Kenzo Tange overseen Expo 70 plan. So you're going to see a lot of domes here, or space frames as well. So this is the tetrahedral space of the Festival Plaza, which harkened to Fuller's 1961 octet truss design and many other Osaka works riffing on horizontal frames. The German and the French pavilions, the Astrorama and the US pavilion domes, as well as several other latticed and dome constructions. I could show you more, but let's just stop there. So with this proliferation of Fuller adjacent public architecture, geodesic domes were perhaps seeming a bit passé to the EAT crowd. Though they couldn't have predicted the final appearance of all these Osaka structures that I've just shown you at the time they were invited into the Pepsi Pavilion planning process. The trend in Fuller was pretty easy to read by 1968 when they were invited. Given the Fullerite experiments, both fecund and derivative, that premiered at Expo 70, the Doi dome was not terribly radical in its appearance or engineering. Inspired by the folds of origami, it did not include any of the tensegrity elements that characterize Fuller's innovations in geodesic dome construction. And tensegrity is a design principle of continuous tension and discontinuous compression that makes geodesic domes materially quite efficient. So for this reason, and others that are not very well documented, the Doi construction was therefore underwhelming to EAT members. According to Forrest Myers, the structure resembled, quote, a crumpled false geodesic dome. So how and why the geodesic dome became so ubiquitous in this period, with its contradictory legacy of patronage by government-sponsored expositions and the military, as well as counterculture communes and radical housing activists, is a story I've told elsewhere, including in my forthcoming book, After Spaceship Earth. But suffice it to say that for EAT, this particular dome was maligned enough for them to work instead to produce, quote, a pavilion that could disappear, end quote, according to EAT site architect John Pierce. Myers, the artist, is credited with the idea of enveloping the structure with fog, and Nikaya, who in previous years had painted clouds she created with dry ice, the solid form of carbon dioxide, melted over a hot plate, was invited to produce a fog shroud over the building. So she was introduced to EAT through her work translating for Rauschenberg in Japan in '64. Nikaya had participated in his work Open Score at 9 Evenings in 1966 in New York. In addition to her work planning the fog piece, Nikaya became the linchpin of EAT's organization of the Osaka venture, acting as translator and liaison in their dealings with Japanese institutions, as well as helping to manage the project budget, which was swelling. Through Kluver, Nikaya was connected to Los Angeles-based physicist Thomas Mee, who was working on vapor systems. In order to realize a water, not chemical-based fog system, of course, like water is a chemical, hydrogen oxide, you can call it dihydrogen monoxide, make it sound really scary. So it's also important to note that Nikaya's relationship to her father's career is key too. Ichikuro Nikaya, her father, died in '62, and he's credited with creating the first artificial snowflake using cooled water vapor. And during World War II, he worked on issues of atmospheric icing and the artificial dissipation of fog for the Japanese military. And several of her designs, Nikaya consulted with her father's former lab partners to finesse the water vapor-based fog she was beginning to use in her work. So after months of wind tests and a prototype built at Mee's Pasadena home in Osaka, 2,520 jet spray nozzles were installed on the roof's external joints. 9 pumps controlled by timers were capable of spraying 40 tons of water per hour into the air, creating a cloud 6 feet thick around the structure. The system accommodated 8 distinct patterns to adjust to different weather conditions. A micro anemometer located on the roof transmitted average readings of the wind direction and velocity to the control room every 6 minutes so that the cloud could be recalibrated based on weather changes, allowing her to manipulate and control the volume, shape, and other aspects of the movement of the fog. As Nikaya writes, a fog sculpture is, quote, molded by the atmosphere and sculpted by wind from moment to moment, unquote. In the Pepsi Pavilion, as with all of her vapor works, Nikaya gathered data about the local conditions, such as average wind speeds and directions, seasonal temperatures and levels of humidity, and her projects bear the numeric code of the local International Weather Station where this data was gathered. Though these pieces emerge from extensive research and data collection, Nikaya does not attempt to artificially fix the uncertainty of nature. Experiencing the vicissitudes of weather is key to the work's reception. As she says, I'm interested less in how to control the wind than in how to negotiate with it. My role is to design a landscape that interacts with the wind, to create a stage where the fog can perform, end quote. And yet exacting preparation goes into the creation of these pseudo-natural events, thereby troubling a sense of sublimity. It requires exacting effort, she says. Fog sculptures do not automatically behave like part of nature. It is important to Nikaya that the apparatus used to create the works remains exposed. Instruments such as nozzles and water hoses are not hidden, and the near continuous hiss of the water spraying is loud and powerful. Even with the programming of these technological apparatuses, fog is by definition mutable and dynamic. There is no such thing as fog at a standstill, writes the art historian Duget, and the miasmic quality of vapor is among the phenomena that most eludes formal boundaries or definition. In Nikaya's work, the complex technologies required to engineer natural occurrences such as fog draw attention to the aesthetic, that is to say, related to sense, properties of air. Remember that the word aesthetics comes from the Greek aesthetikos, which means of sense perception, sensitive, perceptive. Technology is used to dehabituate the often involuntary, therefore largely unsensed aspects of experience. By intensifying the encounter with the sight, Nikaya's stress on atmosphere attunes visitors to the interrelationships of body and stimuli, thereby troubling a sense that agency is a strictly human attribute. As we move, the fog moves in damp eddies around our bodies. Affected by wind currents we have no control over. As we breathe, the fog enters us, and if outdoors, it carries the smells of humus and flora. It conceals that which is near from the eye's apperception. The fog makes evident not just atmosphere, but the fact that atmosphere must be invisible in order for us to see it all. It both visualizes and engineers atmosphere. Air currents are visually detectable, but only by means of an artificially produced weather system of heavy fog. Nikaya's use of technology to expand sense perception emphasizes weather's evanescence, phenomenologically activating bodily sensation. As historian Yuji Morioka has written, my oral perception is activated, someone whispering. As Morioka has written, the relationship between art and technology seen in Nikaya's work is not that of art as an application of technology, which is unceasingly renovated on demand of the consumer society and destined to perish. Nikaya proposes her fog works collaborate with visitors, creating ethics of relationality. As Judith Butler has written, from, quote, that form of relationality we might call ethical, aesthetic relationality also follows. Something impresses itself upon me, and I develop impressions that cannot be fully separated from what acts on me. Butler continues, I am only moved or unmoved by something outside that impinges upon me in a more or less involuntary way, end quote. This ethical relationality is an interdependency, not merely among human participants, but between humans and non-human agents, foregrounding the notion of atmosphere and including in it concepts such as sculpture, installation, and architecture requires uncoupling historic dichotomies of form and formlessness, visibility and invisibility, matter and phenomenon, space and materiality. To Nikaya, her work concerns, quote, the relationship between artificial and natural, things and being, the tangible and the abstract, end quote. In this, she destabilizes fundamental philosophical oppositions about subjectivity, those of subject and object, interiority and exteriority, agency and dependency. Nature has a role as performer. Nature becomes a dramaturgical agent. In her work, I think I missed an image here. Here's a fog test, the wind tunnel test. In this work, Foggy Wake in a Desert and Ecosphere, produced for the 76 Sydney Biennial and resettled as a permanent installation in the Australian National Gallery in Canberra, the piece over time has changed the ecosystem in substantial ways that make evident the normally inconspicuous or dormant elements of nature. So this piece is activated for an hour and a half each day, and the work has, as an effect of this, has thickened the foliage and cultivated local species more dependent on water. In its original incarnation, it was developed as part of a research project about desertification. The work in Canberra is an oasis of humidity and an enclave of darkening fog in an otherwise sunny and arid climate. Nikai's work allows us to untangle a great incongruity that many experimental and creative explorations of the airborne have found their greatest expression and patronage in the largely visual art world of art galleries and art museums. Ascertaining why significant works by modern and contemporary artists are deeply invested in breath, air, and olfaction, creating what critic Swan Hsu calls, quote, airborne transcorporeal art, end quote, requires overcoming considerable roadblocks about the cultural irrelevance or self-evidence of invisible involuntary bodily experiences such as respiration. Scent, taste, and touch are often considered lesser senses in a hierarchy crowned by sight and secondarily by hearing. The priority given to the visual in Western society in particular has nonetheless previously been questioned in cultural and philosophical considerations of aesthetic experience. For Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, overturning the Cartesian construction of distance visual confirmation of experience through cognition meant privileging the experience of touch. Arthur Rimbaud's notion of, quote, a riot of perfume, which emphasized the preeminence of smell and disturbing the senses, is part of a chorus of late 19th century French Romantic symbolists' works on touch and odor by writers like Charles Baudelaire, Émile Zola, Huysmans, Proust, and may seem a place of some remove from this inquiry into matters of contemporary sensory experience. Yet recognition of how the haptic, gustatory, respiratory, and olfactory have been consistently diminished opens up possible opportunities for our contemporary sensual education. Nakai herself uses the Zen concept of ma, translated as gaps or intervals, to discuss the mutable states of water and vapor, a cloud suspension between them, and the manner in which each breath also contains within it a momentary void between inhalation and exhalation. The fog's activation of the senses makes, quote, the visible invisible, as she says, and the invisible, such as wind, becomes visible. To Nikaya, dance practitioners in the West, such as Deborah Hay and Trisha Brown, are like herself, sliced by the blade of Zen as they work in the zone of haptic proprioception, haptic proprioception, in which the body's coordination of space and time demands a keen perception and reception of the dynamics of nature and the sensate body. So in contrast to what Nikaya writes as the Zen-like relation between the individual and the whole, vision often exemplifies cognitive clarity and distance objectivity. As Judith Butler writes, quote, just as philosophy founders time and time again on the question of the body, it tends to separate what is called thinking from what is called sensing, from desire, passion, sexuality, and relations of dependency, end quote. In Mikaya's work, the obscuring properties of fog cause sight to lose its traditional preeminence in the perception of an artwork. Beyond optics, perception is shown to be haptic, respiratory, and therefore olfactory, as the entire body inside and out becomes a surface of contact and exchange. Unlike the manner that physical distance can be understood as a form of power in visual culture, breath is ultimately a transcorporeal swapping of molecules that renders us exposed to what we would often rather designate as the outside. Air, and therefore sense too, enter our body as we inspire, and we don't control much about that exchange. We can close our eyes, but we can't stop breathing. For these reasons, olfaction is perhaps our most vulnerable sense, just as breath is the essential feature of its existence, and ours too. Atmosphere is inside and outside of us all the time. And we share it, exchange it with others, and its use in vapor form to create sculptures and shroud buildings therefore puts into question the solidity, not just of sculptures and architectures, but also the vulnerability of our responses to places and the reliance of our bodies on invisible aspects of nature, such as air and gravity. To use Francois Lyotard's words, such work, quote, presents the fact that the unpresentable exists, to make visible, as he wrote, that there is something which can be conceived, which can neither be seen nor made visible, end quote. That said, we experience Nikaya's work at this moment as a photographic reproduction. And it's notable how many of these photographs depict visitors attempting to take pictures of the fog. So the mise en scène of fog has, of course, long been emblematic of that which is liminal, ambiguous, repressed, especially in horror and noir films. The turbidity of fog makes it difficult to consider it as a whole, rendering it beyond the traditional spatial markers that organize Euclidean geometries, that is to say, vector space. Fog's spatial hybridity collapses historic notions of art as requiring constitutively physical distance. As Nikaya writes, quote, "These fog sculptures are not merely to be viewed from outside as fanciful landscapes, but can be experienced in physical presences to conjoin and converse with from the inside. We not only enter the work," well, end quote, I say, "we not only enter the work, but it also enters us." So I haven't used the words immaterial or dematerialize in this discussion, words that are commonly applied to Nikaya's practice. All art, and in fact, all sense experience is material, and nothing invisible is actually immaterial. Speaking atomically, for example, stereochemistry studies the unique spatial arrangements of atoms and molecules. Metaphysically, abstract thought and complex reminiscences, which distinguish human consciousness from other forms of animal life, are our most immaterial experiences only if you ignore the electromagnetic neural energy that allows contemplation and memory to occur at all. Nikaya's work exists in a threshold between matter, metaphysics, and phenomenology, what she terms, quote, negative sculpture. Her fog works paradoxically present ambiguity. Using Roland Barthes's notion of the threshold, they're, quote, "one of these objects that pose a discrete challenge to science, because they are non-systematic and draw their value, so to speak, from their formal indefiniteness. We might say that conversation belongs to the order of almost," Barth, to end Barth's quote. So making air visible therefore underscores the manner in which this ambiguity of breath experiences, and by extension, olfactory ones, are by definition disregarded. In her more than 20-year career, artist Maki Ueda, a friend of Nikaya since Ueda's days as a student, has experimented with seeing scent, as she writes, allowing audience members to experience this normally invisible sense as a visual phenomenon. In this 2013 work, Invisible White, Ueda created a darkened fog space in which 3 scents were released: sweet orange, essential oil, cologne, which is a sort of watermelon-like mineral smell that is often used for marine accords, and an incense accord that she created, allowing visitors to navigate the gallery through an architecture of smell. Architect Juhan Palasma has written of the visual bias in the construction and navigation of space in his seminal 1996 work, The Eyes of the Skin. Ueda, like Nikaya, allows us to think of this receptive supraocular skin as composed of folds, at times both internal and external, pointing to the manner in which olfaction and breath touch us inside, not merely grazing the casing of our body's external surface. We are flesh with ambiguous edges between skin and the membranes of sense perception. So in Ueda's work, Aerosculpture, it was installed in Arashiyama, an area of Kyoko, Japan, known for its temples and shrines. In English, the etymology of perfume derives from the Latin per, through, and fume, smoke. Traditionally, scented smoke offerings were considered a portal to the divine. Likewise, in Japanese, some words for scent, perfume, and fragrance, koki or kosui, originate in the Chinese character for incense or smell, zheng. And the traditional Japanese practice of kodo, or incense appreciation, uses synesthetic metaphors of listening, manko, to the molecules. Though we can't experience the shrouding fog elements of Nikaya Ueda's work in a lecture hall, I asked Ueda to share with us the olfactory component of the work that refers to the Kodo ceremony, which we will impart here today. So Isabel is going to start passing out scent strips. I have some. And then this is the scent strip dipped in the scent Ueda mailed me from Japan. So hold the strips from their wide side and make sure to dispose of them properly afterwards. So I'm going to pass out some.
So if people are sensitive to scent or aroma and they want to step out, now is the time, and we'll come get you when it's not.
All right. So I'm just going to read you some of the ingredients for this. It's always so hard to talk about scent without talking about literally what the molecules are. So this is from Maki. So this scent contains a lot of resins, guaiac wood, amyris, a bit of a burned incense touch, birch tar, a tobacco accord and patchouli, some sweet balsamic ambery touch cashmere, which is a musk aroma chemical, labdanum and cistus. Labdanum is a really, it's kind of the definition of the amber genre of perfumery. It's a resin that they used to collect off goats' bellies when the goat went through the plants. And it's very, very rich, lovely smell. And cistus is the version of that same, I think it's called rock. I forget the name of the flower, rock. And broxin, which is like a ambergris synthetic, and vanillin, which is the synthetic form of vanilla. Then she says a dry leathery touch, safranal, which is the molecule that is often used for the suede effect. Now, leather doesn't really have a smell other than the tanning that was like historically, the chemicals were used to make it pliable. And they used to put what they called the smell of Spanish leather on leather so that it would not smell like those bad chemicals. So that's what we call the leather, smells are like these artificial, like safranal is an artificial aroma chemical that mimics that Spanish leather smell that was added to leathers. And then IBQ is a very strong, also known as pyranose, very strong kind of animalic smell. And then she has a musky, fruity touch, raspberry ketone, and Damascus beta, and then a spicy touch, clove bud. So there you go. So as the strips have all gone around, I just want to note that what we're encountering is, of course, different than what would be propagating in a veil of fog. So in Ueda's work, she uses dry ice, actually, to create the fog and to distribute the scent. And you can see here her trials, the photographs of her trials. It was designated especially for the low temperature, minus 75 degrees Celsius, as opposed to the high temperature, 250 degrees Celsius, that would be the combustion point of incense. So very cold, dry ice propagation as opposed to the high heat of burning incense. Because liquid carbon dioxide is so cold, Ueda wrote me, the liquid becomes a bit smoky when it's burned on the machine and therefore is more incense-like in the air. Note. So I guess we can just like take one more smell together. So I already went over some of the materials that she used in it. And, in smelling this together, we can experience at least one further sense of Ueda's work beyond the audiovisual realm of our typical scholarly exchange. And I know why people don't do this more often. We have to do like these preambles about sensitivity and, things like that. I've only given a version of an olfactory talk once before, in which I distributed a different scent, and it had to have a legal disclaimer tacked on to the talk description. And, a stanchion was placed outside warning people. So when you specifically mark the act of inhaling, it opens up vulnerabilities and risks. So Ueda and Nakaya's creations of artificial environments, among many of the other artists that I pointed to at the beginning, relate to the reliance on geoengineering that's often unrecognized or taken for granted in contemporary society. As Peter Sloterdijk has noted, attention to what he calls atmospheric ecologies is fraught. Inventions of climate control, such as air conditioning, are part of a complex system of artifices that attempt to manufacture our environments. Writing on Nikaya, the historian Yukuro Furuhaka notes that the reliance on synthesized atmospheres, quote, reveals the existential insecurity of living in a technologically mediated environment. The more we learn about the vulnerabilities of the atmosphere, the more we turn to technology to compensate for and control this vulnerability. And yet weather remains an aspect of nature that stymies human control, and in particular, human technologies. Nikaya points out that, quote, fog is always interfering with our lives. A lot of scientific research is done on ways to disperse it. We're always doing that with our environment, trying to conquer it, end quote. To Nikaya, her choice of the word fog is important. As she stated, fog has a bad image like smog. Smog also makes atmosphere invisible due to human triggered damage to the air quality. Fog too has a negative association for many. I mean, speaking for myself, I most often encounter it while driving or as a passenger in dangerous aeronautical situations. Piloting a vehicle is treacherous during fog events, and recall her father's de-icing and anti-fog experiments for the Japanese military. But when removed from the cocoon of vehicular experience, fog at a pedestrian level can be really enchanting. In Nikaya's case, she programs the work based on her research, yet it nonetheless maintains an autonomous existence outside the artist's command. She creates an artificial microclimate by dramatically increasing the humidity of the surrounding area, yet the fog is never fully controllable. It may become rain or mist, or can largely dissipate based on wind currents or other atmospheric conditions. Nikaya paradoxically creates a natural phenomenon, engineering a process that is in fact both natural and not. It is truly fog, but not where or how fog would normally be experienced. Our habit of ignoring the importance of air, aerosols, and volatile molecules parallels all manner of repressed or neglected knowledge bases relating to the supply chains and natural origin of largely invisible chemical, computing, robotic, and other advanced technologies in our time of specialization. My task here is not to reorder hierarchies to topple sight, but rather to expand, as artists such as Nikaya have done, the notion of, quote, the aesthetic to include all senses, not merely vision. The common lack of concern for and erudition about non-visual experiences is representative of the current state of art history, and broader culture's overemphasis on spectacle and appearance. An interest in the airborne is a concern above all with difference, not control, appreciating what enters one's own body, regardless of our machinations, taking pleasure in the bodies and smells of others, and enjoying the spaces we occupy. One can therefore consider fogworks as part of a project of re-embodiment, moving between the airborne and the internal, the molecular and the social. Nikaya's work asks what developing an awareness of the overlooked can do for us in our visually inclined, one could even say ocular anxious culture, and invites us to lead a richer, more sensuous life. The pandemic years have encouraged a flowering of interest in breath, not only due to the airborne transmission of COVID and the respiratory nature of its symptoms, but also thanks to efforts to retrain those who became anosmic, that is, they lost their sense of smell due to coronavirus. Now that we're out of the COVID lockdowns and those years of mask wearing, but we've undoubtedly been made more aware of our sensate bodies and their respiratory capabilities. And Nikaya's work stands in a self-reflexive relationship to the complex biopolitical moment we now find ourselves in. Nikaya's work inspires, as inhaling is an experience of penetrating, stimulating, and vulnerable exchange, a state of union, however provisional, between inside and outside. Thank you.